The Battle of the Coral Sea from 4 to 8 May 1942 was a major naval battle between the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN, and naval and air forces of the United States and Australia. Taking place in the Pacific theater of World War II, the battle was the first naval action in which the opposing fleets neither sighted nor fired upon one another, attacking over the horizon from aircraft carriers instead. It was also the first military battle between aircraft carriers. To strengthen their defensive position in the South Pacific, the Japanese decided to invade and occupy Port Moresby in New Guinea and Tulagi in the southeastern Solomon Islands. The plan, Operation Mo, involved several major units of Japan's combined fleet. 2 fleet carriers and a light carrier were assigned to provide air cover for the invasion forces, under the overall command of Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue. The U.S. learned of the Japanese plan through signals intelligence and sent 2 U.S. Navy carrier task forces and a joint Australian-American cruiser force to oppose the offensive, under the overall command of U.S. Admiral Frank J. Fletcher. On 3 to 4 May, Japanese forces invaded and occupied Tulagi, although several supporting warships were sunk or damaged in a surprise attack by the U.S. carrier Yorktown. Alerted to the presence of enemy aircraft carriers, the Japanese fleet carriers advanced towards the Coral Sea to locate and destroy the Allied naval forces. On the evening of 6th May, the 2 carrier fleets closed to within 70 nemiao, 81 mirror, on 30 kilometer, but did not detect each other in the darkness. The next day, both fleets launched airstrikes against what they thought were the enemy fleet carriers, but both sides actually attacked other targets. The U.S. sank the Japanese light carrier Shoho, and the Japanese sank the destroyer Sims and damaged the fleet oiler Neosho. On 8th May, both sides finally located and attacked the other's fleet carriers, leaving the Japanese fleet carrier Shokaku damaged, the U.S. fleet carrier Yorktown damaged, and the Lexington so critically damaged it was later scuttled. Both sides having suffered heavy aircraft losses and carriers sunk or damaged, the 2 forces disengaged and retired from the area. Because of the loss of carrier air cover, Inoue also recalled the Port Moresby invasion fleet. Although the battle was a tactical victory for the Japanese in terms of ships sunk, it has been described as a strategic victory for the Allies. The battle marked the first time since the start of the war that a major Japanese advance had been turned back. More important, the damage to Shokaku and the aircraft losses of Zuikaku prevented both ships from participating in the Battle of Midway the following month. On 8th of December 1941, 7th of December U.S. time, Japan declared war on the U.S. and the British Empire after Japanese forces attacked Malaya, Singapore and Hong Kong, as well as the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. In launching this war, Japanese leaders sought to neutralize the U.S. fleet, seize territory rich in natural resources, and obtain strategic military bases to defend their far-flung empire. In the words of the Imperial Japanese Navy, IJN Combined Fleet's Secret Order No. 1, dated 1 November 1941, the goals of the initial Japanese campaigns in the impending war were to eject British and American strength from the Netherlands, Indies, and the Philippines, and to establish a policy of autonomous self-sufficiency and economic independence. To support these goals, during the first few months of 1942, besides Malaya, Japanese forces attacked and took control of the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, New Britain, the Gilbert Islands, and Guam, inflicting heavy losses on opposing Allied land, naval, and air forces. Japan planned to use these conquered territories to establish a perimeter defense for its empire, from which it expected to employ attritional tactics to defeat or exhaust any Allied counterattack shortly after the war began. Japan's Naval General Staff recommended an invasion of northern Australia to prevent Australia from being used as a base to threaten Japan's perimeter defenses in the South Pacific. The Imperial Japanese Army, IJA, rejected the recommendation, stating that it did not have the forces or shipping capacity available to conduct such an operation. At the same time, Vice Admiral Shigeyoshi Inoue, commander of the IJN's 4th Fleet, also called the South Seas Force, which consisted of most of the naval units in the South Pacific area, advocated the occupation of Tulagi in the southeastern Solomon Islands and Port Moresby in New Guinea, which would put northern Australia within range of Japanese land-based aircraft. Inoue believed the capture and control of these locations would provide greater security and defensive depth for the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain. The Navy's General Staff and the IJA accepted Inouye's proposal and promoted further operations, using these locations as supporting bases to seize New Caledonia, Fiji, and Samoa, and thereby cut the supply and communication lines between Australia and the United States. In April 1942, the Army and Navy developed a plan that was titled Operation MO. The plan called for Port Moresby to be invaded from the sea and secured by 10 May. The plan also included the seizure of Tulagi on 2 to 3 May, where the Navy would establish a seaplane base for potential air operations against Allied territories and forces in the South Pacific, and to provide a base for reconnaissance aircraft. Upon the completion of MO, the Navy planned to initiate Operation RY, using ships released from MO to seize Nauru and Ocean Island for their phosphate deposits on 15th of May. Further operations against Fiji, Samoa and New Caledonia, Operation FS, were to be planned once MO and RY were completed. Because of a damaging air attack by Allied land and carrier-based aircraft on Japanese naval forces invading the Lei Salamaua area in New Guinea in March, Inouye requested Japan's combined fleet send carriers to provide air cover for MO. Inouye was especially worried about Allied bombers stationed at air bases in Townsville and Cooktown, Australia, beyond the range of his own bombers, based at Rabaul and Lei. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined fleet, was concurrently planning an operation for June that he hoped would lure the U.S. Navy's carriers, none of which had been damaged in the Pearl Harbor attack, into a decisive showdown in the Central Pacific near Midway Atoll. In the meantime, Yamamoto detached some of his large warships, including 2 fleet carriers, a light carrier, a cruiser division, and 2 destroyer divisions to support MO, and placed Inouye in charge of the naval portion of the operation. Allied response Frank Jack Fletcher, commander of U.S. Task Force 17 unknown to the Japanese, the U.S. Navy, led by the Communications Security Section of the Office of Naval Communications, had for several years enjoyed increasing success with penetrating Japanese communications ciphers and codes. By March 1942, the U.S. was able to decipher up to 15% of the IJN's RO or Naval Codebook decode, called JN-25B by the U.S., which was used by the IJN for about half of its communications. By the end of April, the U.S. was reading up to 85% of the signals broadcast in the RO code. In March 1942, the U.S. first noticed mention of the MO operation in intercepted messages. On 5th April, the U.S. intercepted an IJN message directing a carrier and other large warships to proceed to Inouye's area of operations. On 13th April, the British deciphered an IJN message informing Inouye that the 5th Carrier Division, consisting of the fleet carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, was en route to his command from Formosa via the main IJN base at Truk. The British passed the message to the U.S., along with their conclusion that Port Moresby was the likely target of MO Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, the new commander of U.S. forces in the Central Pacific, and his staff discussed the deciphered messages and agreed that the Japanese were likely initiating a major operation in the Southwest Pacific in early May, with Port Moresby as the probable target. The Allies regarded Port Moresby as a key base for a planned counteroffensive under General Douglas MacArthur against Japanese forces in the Southwest Pacific area. Nimitz's staff also concluded that the Japanese operation might include carrier raids on Allied bases in Samoa and at Suva. Nimitz, after consultation with Admiral Ernest King, Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, decided to contest the Japanese operation by sending all 4 of the Pacific Fleet's available aircraft carriers to the Coral Sea. By 27 April, further signals intelligence confirmed most of the details and targets of the MO and RY plans. On 29 April, Nimitz issued orders that sent his 4 carriers and their supporting warships towards the Coral Sea. Task Force 17, TF-17, commanded by Rear Admiral Fletcher and consisting of the carrier Yorktown, escorted by 3 cruisers and 4 destroyers and supported by a replenishment group of 2 oilers and 2 destroyers, was already in the South Pacific, having departed Tongatabu on 27 April en route to the Coral Sea. TF-11, commanded by Rear Admiral Aubrey Fitch and consisting of the carrier Lexington with 2 cruisers and 5 destroyers, was between Fiji and New Caledonia. TF-16, commanded by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey and including the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, had just returned to Pearl Harbor from the Doolittle raid in the Central Pacific. TF-16 immediately departed, but would not reach the South Pacific in time to participate in the battle. Nimitz placed Fletcher in command of Allied naval forces in the South Pacific area until Halsey arrived with TF-16. Although the Coral Sea area was under MacArthur's command, Fletcher and Halsey were directed to continue to report to Nimitz while in the Coral Sea area, not to MacArthur, based on unencrypted intercepted radio traffic from TF-16 as it returned to Pearl Harbor. The Japanese assumed that all but one of the U.S. Navy's carriers were in the Central Pacific. The Japanese did not know the location of the remaining carrier, but did not expect a U.S. carrier response to MO until the operation was well underway. Further information: Battle of the Coral Sea Order of Battle during late April. The Japanese submarines Row 33 and Row 34 reconnoitered the area where landings were planned. The submarines investigated Rossel Island and the Du Bois Group anchorage in the Louisiade Archipelago, Jomard Channel, and the route to Port Moresby from the east. They did not sight any Allied ships in the area and returned to Rabaul on 23 and 24 April, respectively. The Japanese Port Moresby invasion force, commanded by Rear Admiral Koso Abe, included 11 transport ships carrying about 5,000 soldiers from the IJA's South Seas Detachment, plus about 500 troops from the 3rd Kure Special Naval Landing Force, SNLF. Escorting the transports was the Port Moresby Attack Force with 1 light cruiser and 6 relatively old Kamikaze and Mutsuki-class destroyers, under the command of Rear Admiral Sadamichi Kajioka. Abe's ships departed Rabaul for the 840 NMI 970 Boeing 560-kilometer trip to Port Moresby on 4 May and were joined by Kajioka's force the next day. The ships proceeding at 8 kn 9.2 mi, km, planned to transit the Jomard Channel in the Louisiades to pass around the southern tip of New Guinea to arrive at Port Moresby by $10 May. The Allied garrison at Port Moresby numbered around 5,333 men, but only half of these were infantry and all were badly equipped and undertrained. Map of the battle, 9 May, showing the movements of most of the major forces involved. The Tulagi Invasion Force, commanded by Rear Admiral Kiyohide Shima, consisted of 2 mine layers, 2 older Mutsuki-class destroyers, 5 minesweepers, 2 sub-chasers, and a transport ship carrying about 400 troops from the 3rd Kure SNLF. Supporting the Tulagi force was the covering group with the light carrier Shoho, the IJN's 4 Furitaka Aoba-class heavy cruisers and 1 destroyer, commanded by Rear Admiral Aritomo Goto. A separate cover force, sometimes referred to as the support group, commanded by Rear Admiral Kuninori Marumo, and consisting of 2 light cruisers, the seaplane tender Kamikawa Maru and 3 gunboats, joined the covering group in providing distant protection for the Tulagi invasion. Once Tulagi was secured on 3 or 4 May, the covering group and cover force were to reposition to help screen the Port Moresby invasion. Inoue directed the MO operation from the cruiser Kashima, with which he arrived at Rabaul from Truk on 4th May. Goto's force left Truk on 28th April, cut through the Solomons between Bougainville and Choiseul, and took station near New Georgia Island. Marumo's support group sortied from New Ireland on 29th April, headed for Thousand Ships Bay, Santa Isabel Island, to establish a seaplane base on 2nd May to support the Tulagi assault. Shima's invasion force departed Rabaul on 30th of April. Suikaku anchored in Kobe in September of 1941 after her commissioning. The carrier strike force, with the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku, 2 heavy cruisers and 6 destroyers, sortied from Truk on 1st of May. The strike force was commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Takagi, flag on cruiser Mayoko, with Rear Admiral Chuichi Hara on Zuikaku, in tactical command of the carrier air forces. The carrier strike force was to proceed down the eastern side of the Solomon Islands and enter the Coral Sea, south of Guadalcanal. Once in the Coral Sea, the carriers were to provide air cover for the invasion forces, eliminate Allied air power at Port Moresby, and intercept and destroy any Allied naval forces which entered the Coral Sea in response. En route to the Coral Sea, Takagi's carriers were to deliver 9 Zero fighter aircraft to Rabaul, Bad weather during 2 attempts to make the delivery on 2 or 3 May compelled the aircraft to return to the carriers, stationed 240 nmi, 280 meters, 440 km from Rabaul, and one of the Zeros was forced to ditch in the sea. In order to try to keep to the MO timetable, Takagi was forced to abandon the delivery mission after the second attempt and direct his force towards the Solomon Islands to refuel. To give advance warning of the approach of any Allied naval forces, the Japanese sent submarines I-22, I-24, I-28, and I-29 to form a scouting line in the ocean about 450 nmi, 520 meter, 30 kilometers southwest of Guadalcanal. Fletcher's forces had entered the Coral Sea area before the submarines took station, and the Japanese were therefore unaware of their presence. Another submarine, I-21, which was sent to scout around Noumea, was attacked by Yorktown aircraft on 2nd May. The submarine took no damage and apparently did not realize that it had been attacked by carrier aircraft. Row 33 and Row 34 were also deployed in an attempt to blockade Port Moresby, arriving off the town on 5th May. Neither submarine engaged any ships on the morning of 1st May. TF-17 and TF-11 united about 300 nmi, 350 mir, 60 km northwest of New Caledonia. 16 to 6 is 1 or 62 to 20. Fletcher immediately detached TF-11 to refuel from the oiler Tippecanoe, while TF-17 refueled from Neosho. TF-17 completed refueling the next day, but TF-11 reported that they would not be finished fueling until 4th of May. Fletcher elected to take TF-17 northwest towards the Louisiades and ordered TF-11 to meet TF-44, which was en route from Sydney and Noumea, on 4 May once refueling was complete. TF-44 was a joint Australia-US warship force under MacArthur's command. Led by Australian Rear Admiral John Crace and made up of the cruisers HMAS Australia, Hobart, and USS Chicago, along with 3 destroyers. Once it completed refueling TF-11, Tippecanoe departed the Coral Sea to deliver its remaining fuel to Allied ships at Efate. Ring the battle. Tulagi. Further information. Invasion of Tulagi, May 1942. Early on 3rd of May, Shima's force arrived off Tulagi and began disembarking the naval troops to occupy the island. Tulagi was undefended. The small garrison of Australian commandos and a Royal Australian Air Force reconnaissance unit evacuated just before Shima's arrival. The Japanese forces immediately began construction of a seaplane and communications base. Aircraft from Shoho covered the landings until early afternoon, when Goto's force turned towards Bougainville to refuel in preparation to support the landings at Port Moresby. At 17 on 3rd May, Fletcher was notified that the Japanese Tulagi invasion force had been sighted the day before, approaching the southern Solomons. Unknown to Fletcher, TF-11 completed refueling that morning ahead of schedule and was only 60 nmi, 69 mir or 110 kilometers east of TF-17, but was unable to communicate its status because of Fletcher's orders to maintain radio silence. TF-17 changed course and proceeded at 27 kn, 31 mph, 50 km/h towards Guadalcanal to launch airstrikes against the Japanese forces at Tulagi the next morning. On 4th of May, from a position 100 nmi, 120 meters, 190 kilometers south of Guadalcanal, 11 TR-10s a 158 to 49E, a total of 60 aircraft from TF-17 launched 3 consecutive strikes against Shima's forces off Tulagi. Yorktown's aircraft surprised Shima's ships and sank the destroyer Kikuzuki, Irowanon de Gru 07's 160 to 12E, and 3 of the minesweepers, damaged 4 other ships and destroyed 4 seaplanes which were supporting the landings. The U.S. lost 1 torpedo bomber and 2 fighters in the strikes, but all of the aircrew were eventually rescued. After recovering its aircraft late in the evening of 4th of May, TF-17 retired towards the south. In spite of the damage suffered in the carrier strikes, the Japanese continued construction of the seaplane base and began flying reconnaissance missions from Tulagi. By 6th of May, Takagi's carrier striking force was refueling 350 nmi, 400 mile or mir, 650 kilometers north of Tulagi, when it received word of Fletcher's strike on 4th May. Takagi terminated refueling, headed southeast and sent scout planes to search east of the Solomons, believing that the U.S. carriers were in that area. Since no Allied ships were in that area, the search planes found nothing. At 08:16 on 5 May, TF-17 rendezvoused with TF-11 and TF-44 at a predetermined point, 320 enemy ISI 370 meter Mares, 590 kilometers south of Guadalcanal, 15 degree 160 degree. At about the same time, 4 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters from Yorktown intercepted a Kawanishi H-6K reconnaissance flying boat from the Yokohama Air Group of the 25th Air Flotilla, based at the Shortland Islands, and shot it down 11 NMI, 13 ME, 20 kilometers from TF-11. The aircraft failed to send a report before it crashed, but when it didn't return to base, the Japanese correctly assumed that it had been shot down by carrier aircraft. A message from Pearl Harbor notified Fletcher that radio intelligence deduced the Japanese planned to land their troops at Port Moresby on 10 May and their fleet carriers would likely be operating close to the invasion convoy. Armed with this information, Fletcher directed TF-17 to refuel from Neosho. After the refueling was completed on 6th of May, he planned to take his forces north towards the Louisiades and do battle on 7th of May.